In this lesson, we're going to learn how to set up a Raspberry Pi SpectraCyber software when you first get it. When you first invoke it by clicking on the icon over here, the screen will pop up. This project table may not be populated because it may be empty, since you haven't started anything yet. Basically, you need to do a little bit of setup. We've already talked earlier about how to set up your Raspberry Pi. That you would do down here with your Raspberry Pi configuration. And in the configuration, you need to set up several of your localization over here. You need to set up your time zone, at least. You need the time zone, very important. And then, of course, your keyboard and your country, your Wi-Fi country, should be set up in any locale you might need for your languages. Basically, everything else is fine. Nothing else to do, other than the fact that, of course, if you're going to connect through Wi-Fi, like you would with any Wi-Fi system, up here, you would probably have to connect in. This system here happens to be connected through the Ethernet cable directly, but if you need to, you need to put in your security code here in order to connect through Wi-Fi. But when you run the SpectraCyber program, you're going to need to perform at least a basic setup, and this is done by clicking on the setup button. The first thing would be to configure the observatory. Now, most of the information here is optional. This is my observatory here. But what is important is to set in your latitude and longitude. You can use the up-down arrows here to change your exact position, and then put in some information about your antenna, your elevation and your height, the size of the antenna, diameter, and so on. But the latitude and longitude are very important because you definitely need this information in order to properly track for sidereal time. After you enter that, click OK, and that will be saved in a file, and you don't have to set it up again unless you need to make changes. The second setup for it is configuration here. There's a minor configuration file. If you have a new SpectraCyber, you may have a label on the SpectraCyber for a slight correction frequency due to the crystal. This is to make your cyber extremely accurate. That number would be placed right here, the correction frequency. In my case, I have an older unit. It doesn't need a correction factor, and so the value is defaulted to 0. The working directory, however, is very important because on solid-state devices like micro SD cards, there's a certain number of write operations that you can perform before the card will begin to be damaged. Now, it's a very, very high number, and probably on lifetime would be fine, but to be on the safe side, it's wise to have a working directory that is external. This could be a flash drive plugged into your USB port. In my case, it happens to be a Western Digital MyBook 4 terabyte hard drive that's connected to a USB port. Now, it's important to be aware that on Raspberry Pis, you can power a USB device through the USB ports, but there's a limited amount of power there. If you put in a device that draws too much power, your Raspberry Pi may not boot at all. Probably won't be damaged, but it's wise to use either a powered hub if you're going to hook up a lot of devices that need a lot of power, draw too much current, or something like a external drive like I'm using here would certainly have its own power supply, so it's perfectly safe to connect directly to the USB port. You notice here that on the working directory, you can click on this button and you can browse for where you want to put your data, and you can move, through the system like this. Remember earlier we talked about that in the case of the Raspberry Pi, on the root directory down in the media section, that's where you will find any external drives connected to your USB port. And as it turns out, that's exactly where my drive exists. So I simply used my browser to go down into the section that I needed, and I was able to locate my drive here. I'm in the Media Pi drive at my book. That's my 4 terabyte hard drive, and I'm storing my data in a location called SpectraCyber. So after you've done all of this, that file will be saved, and that will be your working directory. You can change that working directory if you need to for other purposes, so that you can store your data in different locations. So that's basically it on how to do the setup. Once the setup's done, you may not have to do it again unless, of course, you want to change things. One of the advantages of doing it this way is that, say you want to port your data to another PC or an external computer, one smart move would be to set your working directory to a flash drive that you've plugged into the USB port. Do all your data runs. All your data will be saved in a file location over there. And then when you eject that, you can then take that and flash drive and move it to whatever you want. And in fact, I believe this is the location here where you can select a drive to safely eject it. And this is the best way to remove a drive to be sure that you haven't done any damage to it. But anyhow, that's pretty much all you have to do to configure the SpectraCyber for your first time. I hope this has been helpful.